So I'm going to start with tips. I think one of the things that everyone in business has to think about these days is the customer, and different organizations think about it differently. Probably the most cutting edge thought leadership in customer is that the customer is everything. The customer is really what keeps you in business. And so you have to do all of these things in the middle. People have used the term customer delight. But I truly, truly believe that early stage entrepreneurial companies need to underpromise and overdeliver these days. You can't sell sizzle and not really have a great steak, would be one way of saying it. But you also have to pay attention to the customer. So just this next slide is, how I think we have to think about it in 2020, which is that you have to think of your product in terms of the customer as being more necessary than discretionary, because what's happened, depending on who your customer is and what their ability to buy is, it has to be something that they really need. And so what this is also driving on the other side of things is companies thinking about, how do we create products that are great solutions that customers must have? And so the rethinking of who is your customer and every aspect of, how you meet them, so to speak, to engage them as a customer, is something that you have to really, really consider more than ever and look at more than ever. And it's very highly intertwined. So there's an aspect of thinking called the Pareto Principle, which basically is about how it is that, in general, there's an 80-20 rule. It was developed by Wilfredo Pareto back in the late 1800s. He was an economist, and in fact worked on microeconomics, but he also grew peas, and the concept came from growing peas, where 80% of the yield came from 20% of his planted crop. And then it started to translate into, because he lived in Italy, 80% of the wealth was controlled by 20% of the people, and started expanding that into 80% of the consequences come from 20% of the causes. And so in thinking about your customer, there's a rule of thumb that actually 80% of the revenue comes from 20% of your customers. And so if you start thinking about your customer a little differently in terms of who are your customers, what's their loyalty factor, what kind of revenue yield do they have, why do they love you, and how can you amplify all of those things? And so more and more companies, especially companies who've never really had interaction with their customers, and big companies, many big companies distribute and have distribution channels. They only hear from their customers when they're not happy, for the most part. And more of those organizations are doing direct-to-consumer marketing rather than what was traditional brand marketing to support their product in the marketplace at whatever customer purchase points there were. And so I think the huge trend, and that a lot of companies are making now, is direct-to-consumer, where they control the communication channel with the consumer, and they try to essentially amplify how it is that they directly communicate with that consumer. And I think that's not going to change, and that business tip is what I think people need to be doing.